What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect. In this video, I'm going to show how you can create a punch, impact, sweat droplet effect inside of Blender using softbody simulation and mantaflow spray particles. This effect is fairly simple and the concepts behind it can be applied to other applications as well. For this specific tutorial, we'll be adding our impact droplets on top of this live action shot. So in addition to showing how you can simulate and composite this effect, I'll also be going through the camera tracking as well as the object tracking process in order to line up our simulation effectively. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. The first thing I'm going to do is of course just delete everything in our scene here. And I'll just click on the plus button up here and we'll go to a visual effects motion tracking tab. And this is where I'm going to import our footage so that we can track it effectively. So I'll click on open and find our footage. So this is our boxing footage. So I'll go ahead and load this in. And I'll go ahead and click on prefetch so we can see our footage playback in real time here. And we'll kind of choose an end frame for our simulation here as well. So I'll probably have our scene stop around frame 140. So we'll go ahead and change the end frame of our Blender file here to 140. Now let's go ahead and track our shot. So I'll go ahead and change our tracking settings to blurry footage. And since our camera doesn't move through 3D space too much, I'm just going to do a basic tripod track. So under solve, I'll click on the tripod option. And now under track, I will find some points here on this rope behind our character to track effectively. Before we do that, I might just increase our pattern search size a little bit to 58, change our search size to 112. Then I'll just click on a spot here, command click, and I'll press track forward here. And we'll just track this guy forward. And around here, we have our other character's face come in. So now we'll clear the keyframes of this tracking marker after this point using this button right here. So now we have this tracking marker just up to there. And now we'll add some more tracking markers to continue this track. So I think probably this little glimmer on the rope will work pretty well. So we'll go ahead and press Control click and we'll track this guy forward as well. And we'll have that guy go until we lose him. Now we'll clear any tracking points past this moment. We just want to make sure that there's some overlap of our tracking markers so that we have a track of the entire shot. And I do have a full tutorial on how you can 3D track footage effectively in case this specific example is a little bit too quick for you, but this is pretty good here. Now I'll add one more tracking point on the glimmer of this rope here. So I'll press Control click, track this guy forward all the way up to this flash here. Right about here, clear the keyframes after this, and then I'll also track this guy backwards a little bit. So just track that guy backwards, and then let's see, we start losing him around here. So we'll clear before this point. So now we have some pretty good tracking points. We need to go a little bit further here. Let's see here, I will grab a point here, track this guy forward, and that flash is throwing us a little off, so I'll just manually adjust this on that frame. Then we can continue the rest of the way, and now that's looking pretty good. And just for fun, I'll add one more tracking point, tracking backwards from the end of our footage. So I'll find this point right here, track this guy backwards, and I'll remove everything that doesn't work out for us. So this should be pretty good for a very basic tripod track, but let's go ahead and test it out. So I'll select all of our points here and go to solve. We'll select the tripod track option. I'm not going to refine any of our focal length or anything. We'll adjust those manually. And yeah, for now, I'll go ahead and just click on solve camera motion and let's see what we get. So we have a solve error of 0.67 pixels, which is pretty good. I try to get my solve error under 2 pixels. So this should be pretty good, but of course you may need to clean up your track a little bit and make sure things aren't slipping. But again, if you want a more advanced camera tracking tutorial on 3D tracking, if your shot is a little bit different than this, I'll put a link to that advanced camera tracking tutorial in the description below so you can master that technique before you dive into the simulation tutorial. All right, so now that we have a basic camera track, I'm going to set up our 3D scene a little bit further here. First thing I want to do is add a camera to our 3D scene here. So I'll go to layout mode, press Shift A, add a camera to our scene, just push this back to the side here. Now I'll go back to motion tracking and we'll click on set as background to add this footage as our background. Now you can see in our camera view here, our footage is our background. And now I'll also click on set up tracking scene. And now after cleaning this up a bit more, we have a pretty clean track of our camera here. So now it's time to create a head track for our character's face, so then we can attach 3D head geometry with a softbody simulation in order to drive those fluid particles. So we'll go back to our motion tracking tab here, and now what we're going to do is under tracking, we're going to go to object and we're going to add an object to our scene. And now we're going to create an object track for this slot here. As you can see here, we have a camera track. Now this is our secondary object track for our character's face. And this is going to be a very rudimentary object track because we don't have a lot of tracking points for our character's face. We want to just try to get a generalized idea, and then we'll hand animate our head after getting the general placement of everything. And actually, before we do our object track, I do want to set the scale of our scene. So I'll go back to our camera tab, and I will find a frame with 2 tracking points on it, and I will select them here, both of them at the same time. Then I'll scroll down here to set scale, and whatever the distance is between these 2 points, probably 2 feet or so, 1.5 feet. We'll do like, this is in meters, so we'll do like maybe 0.35 meters. We'll go to set scale, and now as you can see here, our camera scale changed a little bit, and that's just going to help our scene be a little bit more accurate. Now that we've set the scale for our camera, go back to our object track here, and I'm just going to select some points on our character's face to object track throughout our scene, and probably his eyes will be a pretty good point of contrast here. So I'll press Control and click on his left eye here. Then I'll just track this guy throughout the scene. So just a few frames for that one, since the hand crosses that tracking point. So that should be fine for that point. And then we'll do another one on this eye. So Control click, just kind of give it a good track here. And if you want, you can always drag these by hand as well. Just want to get a general track of the eye here. And again, we can line this up a bit later as well. Clear the tracks after this. And I'll also track his ear here. Find a point of contrast. Track this guy forward. Something like that, like so. Then I'll go track this guy backwards all the way to the beginning of our scene here, and maybe I'll also track a little bit of his nose here just to have a little bit more data to work with. Just find this point, track this guy forward, something like this. Clear after this. I think that's mostly gonna be good enough. Maybe I'll just hand track this point a little bit further so I have a little bit more to work with. This point on his ear here, and we're going to refine the head track of our 3D model manually as well. So this is just kind of to get the general idea of our movement here. And then I'll track this ear as well, just to have a little bit more data to work with. Track this guy backwards and find where it starts failing, so probably around here. All right, so go ahead and select these points, and we'll do a very quick object motion track. Solve error 7.73 pixels, not that good. Let's go ahead and try it out here for a second. I don't see anything noticeably slipping, so hopefully this will be good enough to align our head to the scene a bit better. Now we need to set the scale of this object, so probably between his eyes here, if we just select the points on his eyes, it's probably around 4 inches or so. That's about 1/3 of a foot, so I'm thinking, let's see, about 0.1 for the distance here, so do 0.1. Now I'll click on set scale, and that'll just help our object track to be a bit more accurate in our scene. And now I'll go to layout mode, and we want to add our 3D head geometry and use this object tracking data on the 3D head geometry and see how it looks. I'll import an OBJ of this head model, which I've downloaded, and I'll put a link to that download in the description below. So I'll go to File, Import, Wavefront OBJ, 3D head model, just import this 3D head object. You can see it pops up right here, and we'll go ahead and delete our cube here if this is just there by default. And we want this guy in the foreground layer. I want to set the origin of our head here to origin to geometry, so now we can rotate it around effectively. So yeah, let's try to line this up to the scene. We just scale it up for now, just kind of rotate it like so. And it doesn't have to be perfect, guys, but we're just trying to get something for a soft body simulation to drive those particles. So we're not actually rendering this element. We're going to create a soft body simulation on this element, which creates the fluid droplets going off of his face. So just keep that in mind. This should be good. We want to go to the object constraint tab with our head model selected, and we're going to add an object solver. And now we're going to select our camera that we've tracked, as well as the object track that we have created. And go ahead and set the inverse so it'll come back to the right point. And now let's give it a quick test. All right, so you can see that we have kind of somewhat of an object track here. It's not perfect because we've barely tracked any points on our character's face, but all we really wanted was a general idea. So in order to get a really accurate object solve, you want to have a lot more points to track, and you want to have more data to work with. But since this footage doesn't have a lot of data to work with as far as tracking goes for our character's face, we're going to have to work with a little bit more of a manual technique here. I do have a tutorial on how you can do object tracking a bit more easily, so I'll put a link to that in the description below as well. But let's go ahead and line up our head as best we can, and then we're going to start running our soft body simulation to drive those sweat fluid particles. So just kind of line this up as best we can here, and now we're going to start keyframing our character's face here a bit more. Try to get the ears lined up here. And one thing we could actually do if we want this to line up a bit more is you could go into proportional editing mode. So we can go into edit mode with our object selected, and then we can, since our character's eyes are a bit high here, we just select some of these points and enable proportional editing. And we can drag these guys down a little bit just to change our character's head shape a little bit more. so we can help line our face up a bit better here. Okay, again, it doesn't have to be perfect because we're just using this to drive our sweat droplets, but obviously the more accurate your head model is, the more it lines up, the better it's going to be. For the sake of this tutorial, I think I'm going to go with this. And notice how this specific head model is modeled with quads, and that's going to help your soft body simulation that we're about to do here be a bit better and more accurate, I would say. And also the more vertices you have, the better that soft body simulation is going to look as well. So now let's keyframe our head here. Now that we've lined it up generally to our scene, I will just kind of scroll through, and yeah, we'll add a keyframe around frame 3 here. We'll press I, add a location, rotation, and scale keyframe, and then we'll just keep animating this at different points along our timeline. So we're going to try to animate the rotation as best we can. Press I, add one there, just keep adding these animation points. So we need to rotate this a little bit now, rotate it down, bring it a little further back. So I'm going to fast forward through this part of my keyframing process, but just try to keyframe, line up your head as the live action shot continues, and add keyframes accordingly so that it lines up as best you can. Just keep in mind, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good enough to drive this soft body simulation. Alright, so this is looking pretty good. When it comes to adding keyframes and animating something, I always try to think of less is more. So I get the major keyframes in place first. So for example, if I know I'm going to animate from frame 0 to frame 77 like I've done here, I'll add those two first. Then I'll try to see how the computer is interpolating those keyframes in between that, and then correct accordingly. So that's why I will start with the major ones and then dial it in as things go further. So sometimes, for example, if we go to the middle between these two keyframes, you'll notice that it already looks pretty good. So I don't need to add another one because that's just going to be more work for me. So try to let the computer do a lot of the interpolating for you, and then if you need to add more, you can then adjust from there and make it more precise if necessary. All right, so now as you can see here, we have a kind of a general simulation here with our character's head, and this is going to be pretty good, I think, for driving our soft body simulation. Got a little bit of stuttering going on here, so we could do some correction, but I think generally it's going to be pretty good. So go ahead and delete our ground plane here really quick so we don't have to deal with that. All right, now let's go ahead and start creating our soft body simulation. Now the first step in creating our soft body simulation is recreating our punch here, hitting the 3D face geometry here. So what I'm going to do in this situation is recreate our hit with the punch here on the face with an animated icosphere that has its collision physics activated. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A, we'll add a mesh icosphere, and you can adjust the subdivisions on your icosphere, but I think 2 is pretty good. Maybe 3 is all right as well to get a little bit better round shape like the live action glove here. Kind of just line this up as best we can to the 3D face in our scene. So something like this. Then I'll go into our camera view here. Now I'll just kind of scale this down a little bit, and I'll go to the beginning of our timeline. I'll press I, add a location, rotation, and scale keyframe for this icosphere. Then I'll just scroll forward to where our punch hits our character right around here. Just move our icosphere accordingly, kind of lining it up with the fist here, like so. I just dial it back a tiny bit, but around frame 6, we'll add another keyframe. So now we have something like that. Okay. And we could animate it following through, but I think this is going to work just fine for the soft body simulation. So in fact, I might even just animate our fist coming back so it pulls away from R, like so. Kind of dial back the keyframe a bit so it's a little slower. So now let's go ahead and enable soft body physics for our face here. So go to our physics properties tab. We'll add soft body physics to this head, and we're going to adjust a few of the settings here. Right now, you'll notice that if we play through our scene, we get this kind of warbly effect. And actually, it's not bad. However, we do need to enable our icosphere collision physics. So go ahead and select the icosphere, add it as collision physics, and keep the default settings. And before we continue, I don't want to lose my project, so let's go ahead and save it really quick, since simulation can cause some crashes on your computer depending on the speed of everything. So go ahead and save this project real quick. Save our project. And I'll go ahead and select our 3D head geometry here, and under our soft body physics, I want to adjust a few settings here before we play through this. We'll leave most of these the same. However, I do want to go under field weight, and we're going to turn off gravity, just so that kind of limits the wobbling on the vertical axis here. So that's the main setting we're going to change. You can also play around with these edges control here. So pull, push, dampening, plasticity, but I found that the default settings worked pretty well for me. And if you want even more accurate results, you can enable self-collision. However, it's going to be much more costly for your computer. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that off because I think this is going to be pretty good. So now I'll go ahead and give this simulation a quick test bake. So we have our icosphere as a collision object, and our head is enabled as a soft body object. So I'll go ahead and go to our cache tab here under the soft body physics and change our end frame to 140, the end of our timeline, and click on bake, and let's see what we get. All right, so we're done baking, and now we have something like this, which is not bad. I do think I want it to run a little bit quicker here, I think. So you can change the simulation speed in the soft body settings. This is the part of this process that requires a bit more experimentation on your part, but I think probably we can delete the bake here, and we want this to line up with our head a little bit more. So one thing I might do, I might enable our punch to go a little bit further into his face for one, so it's a bit more prevalent. And then for our soft body physics, I might even increase the speed of this guy to 1.6. Go ahead and try this out. So even though our footage is in slow motion, our soft body simulation, it's kind of seems like it's a little bit too slow for our footage, but we do want to keep how the footage was shot in mind as we're simulating things. So let's go ahead and check this guy out. Now it's looking like it's going to line up to our head a bit better. We might be able to increase the dampening of this a bit, so it's not creating these circular movements at the end. But really the main part of the simulation we want to be used is just this very beginning portion, so this soft body movement can fling off those spray particles for our fluid simulation. So really the ending is not what we're concerned about. If we just want to try to line it up a bit more, we might be able to do that. Okay, I'm going to make this guy a little bit bigger around here, just for fun. And what we might be able to do here, bring down the simulation speed to 1.4, but then I might just add a little bit of damping to this guy, so maybe 1. Let's give this a shot. All right, so let's check this out. Yeah, this is a little bit better. It's a little bit much, but again, we're just using it to fling off water droplets. All right, so I think this is gonna be pretty good for the sake of adding some sweat droplets to our character here. Now, of course, you could experiment with more settings and try to line up the space a bit more, but since we're mostly interested in this initial hit to fling off the droplets, I think this is gonna be just fine. So now that we have our soft body simulation, let's create our fluid simulation for our sweat droplets. So to do this, first we're going to add a fluid domain to our scene. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A. We'll add a cube to our scene, which will be our fluid domain where our simulation will reside within. I'll just make it just big enough for our fluid simulation. So something like this, just surrounding our head. Then I'll enable fluid physics here, make it a domain, change the domain type to liquid, and then I'll increase our resolution divisions here to get a little bit more detail in our simulation to something like, I'll go with maybe 160 for the sake of this tutorial. But keep in mind, the more you add, the more accurate it's going to be. I also want to apply all transforms to our cube domain here. So I'll press Command A and apply all transforms to have an accurate simulation. And then I will just rename our cube here, fluid domain. And this is looking pretty good. Now what we want to do, in addition to our fluid domain here, we need to add a fluid flow object, and we're going to use our head geometry here as our fluid flow object. So I'll go ahead and minimize our soft body settings, add some fluid physics to this geometry. Then under type, we'll make it a flow object, meaning it will emit fluid into our scene. And for the flow type, we'll change this to liquid. And we want to change the flow behavior to inflow so that this geometry is going to emit fluid when we tell it to. And then we want to keyframe this use flow option when our character is punched. So what we're gonna do is at around frame, go ahead and turn off our fluid domain here for a second so we can be a little bit quicker. So turn off our fluid settings, select our head geometry. So we'll find when our character is hit. So around frame 4 is when we'll keyframe our use flow on. So I'll deselect this here. I'll press I when our cursor is over this checkbox. So we're not going to use this as inflow until our character is hit at frame 4. Then we'll select it on, press I again to add another keyframe, and then around frame 11, we'll turn it off. Now you can see here, we keyframed our fluid flow on and off over the time of our hit. Now for your own example, you may want to experiment with how long this flow object is going to emit particles, but that's the general idea here. You want to keyframe those fluid particles to turn on right when that soft body simulation starts. So this is looking pretty good. One more thing we want to do to our character head geometry here is just turn on initial velocity. And by doing this, our fluid spray particles are actually going to take on the velocity of our soft body simulation at different points of this mesh. So in this case, we're actually using our soft body simulation and the physics behind our soft body simulation to drive how spray particles are emitted from this mesh. So it's a really nice way to use data to drive more data. So this is looking pretty good. Now I'll go to our fluid domain here and we'll give this a quick bake. First, I'll go ahead and turn our fluid back on in viewport mode anyway. And I'll scroll down here to cache, and I want to make this type modular so we can bake this and not play it in our scene, but just bake it once and for all. I'll make it resumable just in case we want to pause the bake. For the start and end frame, I'll just choose our timeline. So go to frame 140. And yeah, this is looking pretty good. Now, mantaflow fluids, you actually bake in steps. So we're gonna bake first our fluid, and then we're going to bake, in this specific tutorial, spray particles after we bake the initial fluid sim. Finally, one more thing I want to do before we click on bake data is actually change the time scale for our fluid simulation. Since our live action footage is in slow motion, it makes sense that our fluid simulation should also be in slow motion as well. So for time scale, I'm just gonna bring this down to say 1/4 the speed. So maybe 0.25, and we'll give this simulation a quick bake to see what it looks like. All right guys, so now we have baked our initial fluid simulation inside of mantaflow, and as you can see here, if we just scroll through our timeline, we're getting a pretty nice looking sweat droplet effect. Now at this point, you may want to adjust some of your fluid simulation settings in order to get a more desirable result, depending on what you're going for. But just keep in mind that this fluid simulation is going to resemble the general shape of your sweat droplets. If you like it generally, then go ahead and keep it. If you want to play around with other settings, like for example, under field weights, one thing you might want to do is just bring down the gravity a bit so that these particles don't drop to the floor so quickly. However, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to leave it as is. And then with some compositing, what you can do is you can actually have the particles fade off a bit and just kind of keyframe the opacity down over time in order to have them kind of fade off as they go away from our character's face here. So depending on how specific you want the droplets to be, you can play around with some field weights and other settings as well. But for me, and for the sake of this tutorial, I think this is going to create a pretty good general concept here with some basic visual effects compositing and masking around our character's face. So now that we have created this general liquid simulation here, I'll scroll down here and we're going to bake some spray particles. So this is for the particles that are a little bit more congregated around the surface of our simulation and then like going fast away from the actual fluid here. So I'll go ahead and click on spray, and depending on how much detail you want, you can up-res the spray particles more, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to up-res our particles by 1, so have the up-res factor around 2, and now we're just going to now save our project, and we'll click on bake particles, and let's see what we get now. All right guys, so now we have our spray particles baked as well. Now that we've done this, it's time to create a sweat droplet on the spray particle system. So as you can see here, if we go to our particle system tab, we'll have 2 different particle systems created for us based on this fluid simulation. And I'll go ahead and turn off the liquid simulation here in viewport mode. And now as you can see here, we'll only see our spray particles, which are the particles we want to instance a droplet onto. So go ahead and turn this guy off in liquid form as well. And now we'll just be working with the spray particle system. So as you can see here, I'll give it a quick playthrough. We have this kind of simulation and it's looking pretty cool here. I think the initial hit is really what we want. We could definitely dial back the amount of particles spray out after the initial hit, but with a little bit of compositing, you can have the particles fade out over time anyway. So this should be just fine. Now let's go ahead and create an icosphere to instance as a droplet on this particle system. So first I'll just turn off our spray particles for now, just so our computer doesn't lag quite so much. And now I'll just press Shift A. We'll add an icosphere to our scene. Just keep the subdivisions around 2. Just bring it off to the side here out of our camera view like so. And we'll relabel this water droplet. Okay. And we'll go to our material settings tab here and we'll add a new material. And I'll change the surface to a mix shader, and I'll change one of these to transparent, and I'll change the other to a glass material. So this is going to create a very basic droplet material here that's a mixture between a transparent material and a glass material. So pretty self-explanatory there. You can play around with other shaders as well. You can try some glossiness, but the particle is going to be so small that most sort of semi-transparent materials should look pretty good with a little bit of reflectivity anyway. So this should be pretty good. Now I'll change under our render properties tab. We'll switch our render engine to cycles. And I'll also, while we're here, I'll click on the seed stopwatch for some noise variation. And I'll also go under film and enable transparent so we don't render any of our background. And now to light up our icosphere here, I'll go to our world properties tab here under color. We'll select environment texture, and we'll go ahead and load in an HDRI that's similar to our live action shot environment. So add that in here, maybe bring down the strength to 0.8 so it's not too bright. And yeah, we do want this water droplet that we're going to instance on this particle system to be smoothly shaded. So I'll just go under object, we'll go to shade smooth, and now this is nice and smooth for us. And yeah, now let's go ahead and instance this on our particle system as a spray droplet. So I'll go to our fluid domain here. One thing I want to do so we don't actually see our fluid domain in its box form here is under particle settings, under viewport display, I'll deselect show emitter. Now we don't have to see the actual cube here, but we'll only see the particles rendered. And then also we want to disable the show emitter in the render settings as well. All right, now we'll go ahead and enable real-time viewing for our spray particle system. And now instead of rendering these spray particles as a halo, we'll render these as an object, and then we'll select that water droplet instance object that we have created. We'll go ahead and select that. And now you can see here, we have that icosphere instance wherever these spray particles are. So this is a nice touch. Obviously our spray particles are a little bit too large, so we can just dial back the scale here in our scale settings. Maybe make this 0.02. That's still pretty big, but let's go ahead and bring up the scale randomness as well while we're here. Another thing we can do is just go to the water droplet and scale this down as well, so we have a little bit more control. So we want to make these water droplets pretty small, pretty subtle, so it's more like a mist that's actually being emitted from our character's face here. So something like this should be pretty good. And now I'll go to render view. Let's see what we're getting so far. And right off the bat, you can see what this is going to do. This is looking pretty nice here. One thing I want to do, I want to disable our proxy boxing glove icosphere here, so we don't actually view this. So we'll go ahead and select this icosphere, and we'll disable it in render mode because we really just wanted this for the simulation. And for the geometry of our head here, we want to make this a similar color to our boxer's head in the shot as well, so that we have realistic reflections on our water droplets, even if we don't actually render the head itself. So one thing I want to do, I'll just turn on all of our restriction toggles here so we can actually deal with things a bit more effectively. And now I'll go to our material settings for our head here, and I'll just change this base color to kind of a skin material. So I'll select the ear of our character here. Now it's just a little bit darker, so the environmental reflections on our sweat droplets here will be a bit more accurate. Now I'll go ahead and create a new collection for our head here so we can use it as a holdout for our droplets. So I'll press M, add this to a new collection. We'll call it head geometry. Okay, and now we'll enable this as a holdout as well as enable the indirect lighting option. So now you can see here any droplets that are within the head itself are actually not being shown in the scene. And yeah, this is looking pretty cool here. I think maybe our droplets are still a little bit too big. So I'll select our fluid domain once more, go to the particle settings, and just dial down the scale to maybe 0.016. And yeah, that's pretty good. Of course, this kind of depends on your taste as well, but I think this is going to be a nice mist of sweat particles. I'll kind of clean up our collections here. I don't need this background collection, so I'll go ahead and delete that. I also don't need to render any background view layer that has been automatically created, so I'll go ahead and go to our background view layer and delete this. And now we just have one foreground view layer. And yeah, this is looking pretty good. I do want to light the particles a bit differently. You can see in the live action shot, we have a backlight hitting our character from the back right here, as well as another one from the back left. So we're going to try to replicate that. So I'll delete the lights in our scene so far. So go ahead and delete that. And I'll just press Shift A. We'll add a light here, area light, add this back here. And I'm going to, in the meantime, while I do this, turn off the spray particles so we have a little bit more fluidity since our computer doesn't have to render all these particles as we're working. So I'll place one backlight back here, kind of behind our character, like so. Maybe scale it up a bit. We want to try to get as close to the live action lighting as possible. Then duplicate this one, put this over here, and view through the camera. All right, so we want to try to replicate that live action lighting in our CG environment so that we have a much more realistic composite. All right, so I'll go ahead and select our lighting settings as well, and I'll change the color to the same color as the lights in our shot, something a little warmer possibly. Do the same thing to this area light, just a little warmer, and I'll also bring up the power of our lights as well. I'll go into render view here, and just so we have good reference, I'll turn off our holdout and indirect only for now, and just increase the power of these lights for a second. Maybe make these 2000. Now you can see we have a nice kicker on the back of our character's head here, maybe a little bit bigger, maybe 4000. And then I'll also make this light on this side 4000 as well. And now we have some similar lighting that matches our live action shot a bit better. I'll re-enable the hold out and indirect only on this head geometry collection. And now under fluid domain, I'll re-enable our spray particles here so we can see what we're getting so far. And yeah, you can see kind of the specularity that's looking much nicer on our fluid particles. And yeah, let's give this a quick test render and see what we get. Under our render settings, I'll render at 1920 by 1080p at 100%. And then under our render properties tab here, I'll make the render samples around 32 just for the sake of this tutorial. And yeah, we will enable motion blur, so you have a little bit of motion blur on the particles already. I might bring it down a little bit though to 0.35. And now I'll go ahead and click on render and render image, and let's check out our element. Alright guys, so right off the bat, our first test render looks something like this, and it's looking okay. However, this element needs some compositing to bring it into the shot a bit better. So I'll go ahead and go to our compositing tab here and get you guys started in this process as well. So we'll go to our compositing tab, and the first thing I want to do for this element is just give it a little bit of blur so that it's not so sharp in our shot here. So as you can see here, our foreground render layer here includes our water droplets. So if we go to output, viewer, we can take a look at this guy by itself, just our water droplets, and you can see the denoising going on there, but it shouldn't be too bad once we add some blur to this anyway. So go ahead and close this. I'll go ahead and add some blur to our element here, as well as some basic color correction, and I'll show you guys how to do some masking on this element as well. So go ahead and press Shift A, add a filter blur node right here, and then I'll check the bokeh and gamma checkboxes here, and I'll increase the blur here on the x-axis quite a bit, since our water droplets are mostly going from left to right here. Increase this a little bit so they look a little bit more like they're flying off of his face. Then I'll also increase the Y blur as well, a tiny bit, so that's already looking a bit better. Now I will color correct this element a bit as well. So I'll press Shift A, go to color, RGB curves, add this right here, and I think I'll just bring down the brightness a tiny bit here. And then I'll also just bring down the blue channel a little bit. I think it could use a little bit of warmth. So one thing we could also do, rather than actually bringing down the blue channel, we could just press Shift A, add a color balance node right here. Then we could just warm it up a bit. Since our lights in the scene are kind of warm, we can also warm up our element. So that's already looking a little bit better, like there's some sweat droplets being lit up by the light there. I do want to maybe increase the blur a little bit more. And one thing I also want to show you guys is how you can mask out the foreground gloves here. So, you know, the sweat droplets are just coming off of the left of his face here. So in order to do this, we can go to a new tab for visual effects and masking. Go ahead and open up our footage here. And now we're going to create that very basic mask on this specific frame. So I'll go to new mask. We'll call this foreground gloves. Now just press Command click, and we'll just create a mask around our foreground gloves. I'm gonna do this very quickly here guys, just for the sake of this tutorial. But of course you can keyframe this mask as well for a moving shot like I've done in my final video. So I'll go something like this. And now we have a complete mask, and I might select all of our mask here and just scale the feather a bit, just a tiny bit like this. And now we'll go back into our compositing tab, and we'll actually grab our movie clip data here, press Shift D, duplicate this, and I will delete this background node since it's not doing anything. Now we'll actually overlay this on top of our composite, but we only want to overlay our footage here where we have created that mask. So you can see if I turn this off, we have our composite we've created so far, which is a little bit too green. Kind of dial this back a little bit. So now let's go ahead and use that mask data. So I'll press Shift A, we'll search for a set alpha node, add this right here, and now I'll press Shift A again, go to Input, Mask, connect our mask to the alpha input of our set alpha node, and for this mask node we'll select the foreground gloves mask that we have created. Select that, and now if we increase this all the way, you can see that we've actually overlaid our live action footage only where that mask is taking place. So now you can see our sweat droplets are better composited into our scene already. And yeah, these sweat drops are looking pretty decent here. At this point, it's a matter of duplicating and layering different elements on top of each other in the compositing process. Of course, for your final composite, you'll have to rotoscope out the foreground portion of your footage like I've done in this specific shot, except throughout your entire footage. So you actually have to keyframe your gloves, and I've actually done all of my roto work to composite this droplet element inside of After Effects. So you can see here I actually have a variety of different masks to work with in order to composite our droplets effectively, as well as some radio blur to blur our droplets near the edges here. So you can see I've created some feathered animated masks around different portions of our footage here so that our droplet render shows up in some places but not so much in others. And all of these masks are feathered very specifically so that the droplets kind of fade off as they go towards toward them. So for example, this purple mask right here, as the droplets reach this area, they're slowly fading off as they lose the light behind our character here. So a lot of this comes down to overlaying different elements from your live action footage on top of this impact element that you have created. And I'll put a link to the more specific breakdown of how I composited the elements into the shot a bit better in the description below. So if you want to learn more about this compositing process inside of After Effects, you can check it out there as well. Anyways guys, if you're satisfied with your impact sweat droplet simulation here, to render out this element and get started in the compositing process, all you have to do is create an output file to save this animation. So I'll go ahead and go to our output tab here and create a new folder for it. We'll call this impact droplet element, like so. Accept, and we'll render this as a PNG with an alpha channel at 1920 by 1080p resolution. And to render out just the element by itself, under the compositing tab, instead of rendering out this composite that we have created, if you want to have a little bit more control in your compositing process by rendering out the entire length of the element, you can just move this composite down here to where our actual element is being output, and we'll just connect this guy to our composite output. So now our file will just contain the element that we have created with an alpha channel, so that you can overlay this in Blender or in any other compositing software of your choice. Now all you have to do is choose however many samples you want to render out this element with, and finally you can click on render and render animation, and Blender will render out this element so that you can composite it effectively into your live action shot. Anyways guys, that is it for this video. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to learn next on the channel. Subscribe if you're interested in more visual effect and filmmaking content, and I'll see you next time.